KT, what do you think Zelensky and European allies needed to accomplish today in this phone call or this virtual meeting?
But first of all, it was necessary that they talked and that the president would not just fly to Alaska without having consulted the European allies and partners and also the NATO SecGen. It was a necessary meeting. Whether it was fruitful remains to be seen, and we'll see that on Friday. The Europeans currently are still lingering between, I'd say, hopes, skepticism, and a certain amount of despair. And I think it's good news that they talked. Nevertheless, it's seen very skeptically over here that Zelensky is not part of the meeting in Alaska, and therefore we have a history of rather ill-considered agreements driven by the American president, and that's something Europeans also keep in mind. So that's the hope part here. The skepticism part I've explained to you.
Ambassador, there were 3 meetings today. There may be one still going on as we speak. The Europeans meeting before and after their conversation with President Trump and Vice President Vance. And then we were told they would meet again with Canada and the UK without the Americans. So there was the one call with the Americans sandwiched in the middle. What do you make of how that's unfolding?
Well, I think you see now in Europe and in Ukraine a bit of nervousness about this meeting in Alaska. I mean, first of all, the fact of the meeting itself is a win for Vladimir Putin because it breaks the isolation that Western leaders have imposed on Putin going back to February of 2022. But also the concern is that Putin is trying to lay a trap for President Trump. Putin wants to negotiate the settlement to Russia-Ukraine, not with Volodymyr Zelensky. He wants to negotiate it with Donald Trump. That's because he, Putin, knows the details of this in a way that Mr. Trump does not. And so you've seen also in the run-up to this, Mr. Trump forego. He did not do sanctions last week as he'd suggested. So this is actually a setting where I think Putin expects he has a chance to score some possibly big victories. And the conversations that are taking place now across the Atlantic are Europeans and President Zelensky trying to hopefully encourage Mr. Trump not to walk into that Putin trap.
Of course, Putin's going to be watching for any daylight between the U.S. and allies there in the region. Just a few days ago, Secretary General Mark Rutte, who I believe was on this phone call today, was asked about peace talks and the Trump-Putin meeting. And he said, quote, "It's important to see how serious Putin is. And the only one who can do that is President Trump." KT, do you agree?
I do agree. It's the one thing I see here is, yes, it's the 2 strongest partners or not partners, the 2 strongest players in this whole horrible game we're in right now. They're sitting together, yes. On the other hand, we have to be careful that we're not sliding into a repeat of Yalta. It's just after the Second World War, where 2 major powers are actually remapping their spheres of influence. And that is a fear you sense currently in Europe and also within NATO. So I think it's good that there was some guidance given today and also a clear message from the Europeans where their red lines are and what's to be expected. And to expect that our security guarantees is a ceasefire agreement. Are not any land swaps taking place without Zelensky agreeing to it. And the American president can be easily charmed, as we all know. And if there's one mastermind when it comes to deceiving and charming someone, then it's the Russian president, whom I've met in previous years. And he can be very charming, but this is something where I see the highest risk right now when we look at this coming Friday.
Just moments ago, the president of the EU Commission posted on social media, and she wrote, in part, "Today, Europe, the U.S., and NATO have strengthened the common ground for Ukraine. We will remain in close coordination. Nobody wants peace more than us, a just and lasting peace." KT, I wonder, do allies trust President Trump?
We have our history with him. And on the other hand, there are a few players now in Europe that do have some access and to whom he obviously started to listen. Whether that leads to conclusions where we are all aligned remains to be seen on Friday. So as I've said before, trust needs to be regained, and trust has been shattered over the last few years. So hope is probably the driving force right now. And if you've just quoted Ursula von der Leyen, that was a piece of poetry probably, and somehow reflecting that hope.
Yamiche, what are we learning about the president's strategy going into that high-stakes meeting with Putin?
Well, it's really interesting. We're learning at least that the president was open to hearing from President Zelensky and as well as the leaders of Europe. But we also aren't clear about sort of what the president specifically wants to get out of this meeting when it comes to sort of the measures of success for it. We know that the president said that he'll know within the first 2 minutes of looking at Vladimir Putin whether he's interested in making a deal. When someone pressed him, when reporters pressed him at the press conference that we were at earlier this week, the president said, well, it's because I'm used to making deals. So he's certainly looking at this from his experience as a real estate investor and businessman, but it'll be very interesting to see sort of what other kind of strategy we see coming out of this meeting. I was in Helsinki when the president met with Vladimir Putin last time in his first administration. What was striking then, being in the room, was that President Trump was sort of not himself in that he was a little bit more demure. He was a little bit more conciliatory to Russia. Remember, famously, he took the side of Russia when a reporter pressed him on whether he believed Russia interfered in the 26th election. That was, of course, over U.S. intelligence agencies. So it's going to be very interesting to see not only, of course, what happens in the meeting, but after the meeting, we expect, I think the president wants to at some point talk to reporters shortly after the meeting. And it'll be very interesting to see sort of the tone the president takes, because he has been critical of Vladimir Putin in the past, but now it seems like he thinks that Vladimir Putin might be interested in peace this time around. Anna?
Ambassador, we know Friday's meeting will be on a military base in Anchorage. That was some new information we learned overnight. What's your thought on that choice, and what kind of choreography is happening right now to prepare that?
Well, I think the reason that they chose that military base is that it makes the logistics more easy. It's not like there's a lot of places in Alaska that have the infrastructure to support the visit by the two presidents. So that's probably a big reason why they chose Elmendorf. I would like to come back to this question about, what comes out of Alaska. And I guess the concern I have here is, over the last week or so, we have seen Mr. Trump move dramatically. So if you go back to a week ago Monday, the expectation on Friday was that there was going to be sanctions on Russia. And instead, we had the announcement of this meeting. And while certainly Mr. Trump has talked in a more critical way about the Russian president, we haven't really seen him take tough actions. There really have been no new sanctions applied by the Trump administration against Russia, despite Russia continuing to prosecute this horrible war against Ukraine. And so that makes me a bit nervous that, will Mr. Trump show the appropriate toughness when he deals with Putin, as opposed to being charmed by Putin?
Yeah, KT, President Trump has been talking tough recently about Putin, but I wonder what is the best way to deal with him face to face to get an outcome that Zelensky and European allies can feel okay about.
The only language Putin understands is credible strength, and not just flip-flopping, and that is something he can play with. He's certainly a scenario planner, and he has most probably all things considered that might come out of the mouth of the American president on that very meeting. So the thing, our experience is and was with him, although we've been weak in Europe for many, many decades, the moment we step up and the moment we ramped up now over the last few months caused at least different reactions in Europe and if in Russia. And if Europe and the US are aligned, and if that alliance sets the right message and the right tone, that is something that might get Putin moving and not the other way around.
Ambassador Axios summed it up this way as far as the stakes for Zelensky. Quote, Zelensky faces a perfect storm, a sudden Russian battlefield breakthrough, mounting discontent at home, and a high-stakes summit in Alaska on Friday that could back him into a diplomatic corner. What's on the line for him?
Well, no, I think Zelensky is concerned that there might be some outcome in Alaska that, in fact, aligns the United States more closely with the Russian position. But remember, at the end of the day, Zelensky and Ukrainians have agency. They can say if anything that comes out of Alaska contradicts Ukrainian interests, they can always say, no, we are prepared to fight on. I think Ukrainians would like a settlement, they would like a ceasefire, but they're not prepared to capitulate. And this is the thing I would agree very much about, creating an approach to Putin. If we want to get the Russians to change their negotiating approach, and thus far their demands have only hardened since 2022, we have to create in Moscow a perception that A, Russia cannot win its goals on the battlefield, and B, that if they continue to try to do that on the battlefield, the costs to Russia are going to become unacceptably high. And that means taking a strong position, a position of principle on the negotiations, but also making clear that if Russia continues this fight, the economic, political, and military costs to Russia are only going to increase.
Ambassador, I see you nodding along. Do you have a final thought on just the tough position Zelensky's in this moment?
His position is tough. On the other hand, one thing has improved. He has more or less the full backing of almost all NATO players, with one but the strongest partner sometimes being in an unpredictable role, but especially from the European Union, the Europeans, maybe with the exception of Viktor Orban. So that is something which I think does not weaken his position entirely, but the next days are certainly decisive for his future as well.
Ambassador Stephen Pifer and Minister Katie zu Guttenberg, guys, thank you very much for offering your expertise and your insights.